All right. So we're going to talk about African Americans and the impact of World War II on them. But I want to give you a little bit of a backdrop to some of the things that were creating some major tension. One of the big cases, the Scottsboro Boys. This was a group of African Americans that were riding the trains, which was pretty common during the Great Depression. And they got into a fight with a group of white hobos as well that were on the train. They were taken off in Scottsboro, Alabama, and were then charged with gang rape of a woman, 2 women. The evidence was very faulty. The court case was badly handled and corrupt, and this created nationwide anger. Some of these boys, even the 13-year-old one, the jury held out because they wanted him to, this guy right here, they wanted him to be on trial they wanted him to get the death penalty, even though he wasn't up for that. Some of these others some of these were executed, even though eventually they were all pardoned as the evidence came out that it was not them. So this created a lot of continual tension between the races. And this is one of the things that led to the WWII campaign. The WWII campaign was the idea, it was victory over enemy abroad and discrimination at home. Editorial from the Chicago Defender, an African-American newspaper. Why die for democracy for some foreign country when we don't have it here? What democracy have we enjoyed since the last World War? Have we enjoyed since the last World War? Are our people segregated? Are they not Jim Crowed and lynched? Are their civil and constitutional rights respected? And the Pittsburgh Courier, another African-American newspaper, was the first one to coin this idea of the WWII for victory. You can see it right here, which was created as a symbol. And this WWII campaign began to use some of the things that were started during the Great Depression of don't buy where you can't work, and some of these other grassroots movements that were basically meant to say, hey, we are done with the discrimination and the violence that has been happening all along, and we need to deal with this. And not only deal with this with Hitler and what's going on in Europe, but that we also need to fight this discrimination at home. Everybody's talking about how horrible Nazism is, and yet our friends, our fellow black people are being lynched in the South and being treated horribly. Military service. African Americans participated in the military in a kind of whole new way, and you could say that this brought some of these racial tensions to a head. The pre-draft army, 5,000 black soldiers, and in an army of about 100,000 men. Most of these soldiers were in the Navy. They were cooks. They were truck drivers. They did very little actual fighting or work. Most of them worked in the Transportation Corps, port battalions, and construction units. The Marine Corps and the Army Air Force did not accept any African Americans at all originally, whereas the Army and the Navy were segregated. By the end of 1944, there were 700,000 African Americans in the Army, about 9% of the total, and about 5% African American officers, although a majority were serving overseas. They were still almost all in service units. Most of these worked in Transportation Corps, port battalions, and construction units. Military police did not allow blacks into combat units until 1944. And yet, what we're going to look at is some of the more successful groups, despite the fact that so many African Americans were in the Army, over 700,000, only around 5,000 were African American officers, and majority of these were serving overseas. They were not actually there. Only 50,000 black troops out of the 700,000 actually engaged in enemy combat. The 761st Tank Battalion served in 6 European countries and fought in the Battle of the Bulge. which was the last battle for Hitler. You can see here is somebody who received the presidential citation for their contributions to winning the war. This was Messman Dory Miller, who was basically a cook aboard the USS Missouri during the attack on Pearl Harbor. He manned a machine gun and returned fire on the Japanese while others were jumping off board and shot down 4 planes. Air Corps gave 82 flying crosses to African-American pilots that came from the Tuskegee Institute. Basically, in 1943, the African-Americans were accepted into the Army Air Force because of just a lack of people, and also because of consistent, basically, lobbying by the Black Cabinet and other African-Americans who were trying to push the government into allowing them more in actual flying citations. There was quite a few senators that worked against this and tried to defeat them. They were discredited. They had a bad record because they were shown they showed up late to meetings because the meetings were changed without them knowing. There were some reports of just poor choices, but that's also because they flew 3 times the amount of missions that whites did. Whites were rotated home about 3 times as fast as African-American pilots. At the same time, this was over 600 pilots were trained, and these were the best of the best. They all had really high scores on the Army test, and they were considered some of the best pilots. And the Tuskegee Airmen had an amazing record as far as never losing a plane, a bomber that was under their escort. And that was partly because by the time they started escorting, because they were kept in Africa for a long time after the U.S. troops had already moved up, that there wasn't a lot of German fighters. But at the same time, other groups were still losing bombers, and the Tuskegee Airmen didn't at all. Benjamin O. Davis, a West Point graduate, was the commander. Benjamin O. Davis spent 4 years at West Point and was never talked to by any of his white classmates for the most part. It was given the silent treatment. So despite constant racism and even efforts of U.S. congressmen to ground them, they never lost a bomber towards the end of the war and received more, decorated with more citations than any other flying unit. Okay, we went through this. The Army put mostly Southern white officers to command black units, to command black units. And this was just because they didn't have a lot of black officers, and also because a lot of people in the Army didn't want African Americans to actually work out. This seemed to lower morale, and so in 1942, George Marshall, after getting reports of the undisciplined conduct of the black units, deemed that the officers were mediocre at best, and basically said that, okay, it's not the blacks that are the problem here, it's the black officers. German POWs also received better treatment than black Americans. They were allowed to ride in the white-only cars, were given food, and better conditions than some African Americans, and were treated better than African Americans at times. Overall, the WWII campaign, still during the Depression, they were the first fired and last hired. African Americans were excluded from a lot of training programs. They still suffered in 1940 as the unemployment rate is going down for everyone except for African Americans. Their unemployment rate was still 25%. African Americans were excluded from the intensive training programs to manufacture war supplies and those opportunities, and were confined to the employment primarily in service and unskilled positions. And so they just weren't allowed the positions and the type of jobs that they wanted. Black men were also segregated in the Army, restricted to menial service in the Navy, and barred from other branches of the military. Black men were segregated in the Army and Navy. A. Philip Randolph, and this is a name that you need to know. A. Philip Randolph was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was a union. And so he was one of the more powerful spokesmen for African Americans because of the size of his union. The War Department, so he was actually invited to meet with the president. right after he met with the president about using more. He met with the president, discussed the armed forces' use of black manpower. He wanted the blacks to be used in more combat situations. And basically, the War Department, after they knew he met with the president, issued a statement after meeting that affirmed its policy of segregating black soldiers, and that implied that the black leaders, including Philip Randolph, acquiesced to this policy, that they agreed with it. The whole reason they met with the president was because they disagreed with it. And this made African American leaders basically show that they needed to do something to make change, and that change was not going to happen without some type of motivation. So what happened was that basically A. Philip Randolph called for a march on Washington. He called for this in January 1941. And basically to march on Washington against discrimination in defense industries and the military, because they weren't given jobs in the defense industry. They weren't allowed to fight, or were segregated in the armed forces. And so basically they wanted to march on Washington to show what was happening to African Americans. Now, this obviously would be extremely embarrassing for Roosevelt, who's talking about tyranny abroad and the oppressiveness of the Nazis, to have blacks march on Washington to show that they were not being treated equally. The March on Washington Committee was created basically to make this happen. It was organized and selected July 1st as the date for the demonstration. And this group became a grassroots organization that actually kind of brought about a lot of the different ideas that came to the civil rights movement. And the March on Washington movement showed how African Americans could communicate and organize and work from the ground up. The March on Washington Committee forbid whites to be a part of it because they were afraid that they would be infiltrated by the communists, and all they needed was one communist there for them to be completely discredited because of the fear of communism. Randolph announced 10,000 blacks marching on Washington. The number estimated grew to 100,000 and was going up every day. African Americans were not happy, and that number would have continued to grow. When Martin Luther King marched, there was millions. Randolph met with FDR. The Executive Order 8802 came out of this meeting. Banning discrimination in employment. This was basically saying that African Americans needed to be employed in defense industries, and it was an executive order saying that banning discrimination in employment in defense industries and government, and establishing a fair employment practices committee. Now, they can't deal with states' employment rights. They can't deal with this, but any company that was getting a defense contract for the government is then liable to the government's laws. And by saying, okay, let's say that you are no longer allowed to employ. So Roosevelt made this deal so that he could keep the March on Washington from happening, because basically A. Philip Randolph and other black leaders canceled the March on Washington, and because of this executive order, and that also created the Fair Employment Practices Committee that were supposed to kind of oversee this. For the most part, most people believe that this committee was underfunded and deemed it as ineffective. They basically were supposed to investigate companies, and they didn't do a very good job on it. There was companies that were very clearly discriminating against African Americans and weren't dealt with. However, blacks in war production jobs did go up from 3% in 1942 to 8% in 1944. 5% growth is significant despite the fact that this happened. Now the question is, should they have done this? Should they have sacrificed the March on Washington in order to get the Executive Order 8802, or was this a poor job? Was this a poor trade? Should they have done the March on Washington and move forward that way? Increased activism. One of the things that came out of World War II is the increasing need for African Americans to move forward towards civil rights. Now, I'm not saying they became equal after World War II. I'm not even saying conditions really changed. But the idea of moving forward towards the need for it began to happen. The NAACP, National Association of Colored People, Smith versus Allwright, basically taking on this idea that in major cities during the summers, 1942, blackouts. Okay, so basically this idea was a case over Democratic primaries and whether African Americans were allowed to vote at Democratic primaries, and it was in the favor of African Americans voting. Membership went from 50,000 in 1942 to 450,000 in 1945, and that's for the NAACP. CORE, which was a Congress of organizing equal rights, was basically a organization of young people that began to work towards basically the double victory campaign. Yet, despite the fact that this happened, increasing racial tension, there was the Detroit race riot and the Harlem race riot. The Detroit riot was in June 1943. A series of fights between blacks and whites in a city park in Detroit grew into a major riot when nearby white sailors joined in. That night, groups of African Americans attacked stores and streetcars. 2 whites, including a milkman and a doctor making a house call, were beaten to death. The next day, mobs of whites began attacking African Americans they could find. Troops were called in the end to the chaos, but a total of 34 people, 25 of them African Americans, were killed and 700 injured. A Harlem riot, a smaller riot, occurred in Harlem neighborhood of New York City in August 1943, and when a false rumor spread that a white police officer had shot and killed an African American soldier, 5 people were killed and nearly 400 injured. Such disturbances made it clear to Roosevelt that something might need to happen. And he began to continue to look at this, created a committee to investigate the racial tensions, and showed that there was going to need to be a long-term solution to the race issues that were happening in Washington, in the areas, as people just, that there was just a lack of racial equality. And that was being shown very clearly that something needed to change. The Air Force in 1947, after the war, voluntarily undertook a measure of racial integration. The Air Force was created as a separate branch, and they just weren't very big, and segregation just didn't make sense. And so it was a practical matter of just voluntarily integrating. Well, with the success of that, basically President Harry Truman gave the order to integrate all armed forces in 1948. And it wasn't until the Korean War, however, in the 50s, that this forced the armed services to obey, just because they didn't need to. So the question as we go forward here is, to what extent did these movements, did the increased activism that we see in African American communities, some things I didn't quite mention before, but in major cities during the summer of 1942, there were blackouts in black neighborhoods that closed stores, had shades drawn, and all activity at a standstill to kind of continue to push for this double V campaign. 25,000 blacks would gather at rallies in New York City, announced its intent of using nonviolent techniques to bring an end to segregation, and race riots in 1943 dampened some of this excitement. And so that's where the race riots fit in, is they really worked against this. Now, during the war, 700,000 African Americans, many from the South, moved to industrial cities. This is considered the second great migration of African Americans. 60,000 moved to Detroit alone. And this is what led to some of the race riots, is just the competition for industrial jobs and housing as African Americans were moving north, because of just how many people from the South was considered just the place where most of the problems were. However, you can see, though, that there were over 250 racial battles, most of these were small riots in northern cities, that it wasn't just the South that had issues. And so African Americans realized that they were going to need to move forward and continue to move forward if they were going to reach equal rights. But you can see that things were starting to happen and things were starting to move, and you can see the beginning of a civil rights movement. And there is a connection, I think you can make a connection to World War II. Thank you, and that will be the end of this podcast.